Pulmonary ventilation can be studied by recording the volume movement of air into and out of the lungs, a method called spirometry. And a spirometry machine or a spirometer are shown here. The basic spirometer consists of a drum inverted over a chamber of water. The newer spirometers are already more compact and digital. To take the test, one is seated and then is asked to breathe into a small machine, and the device will record the amount of air that is breathed in and out, as well as the speed of the breath. Pulmonary volumes are an important aspect of pulmonary function testing because they provide information about the physical condition of the lungs. It can distinguish between restrictive and obstructive lung conditions, among others. This figure shows a spirogram indicating changes in lung volume under different conditions of breathing. For ease in describing the events of pulmonary ventilation, the air in the lungs has been subdivided into 4 volumes and 4 capacities. So for the volume, we have the tidal volume, we have the inspiratory reserve volume, the expiratory reserve volume, and the residual volume. And 4 capacities, which are the averages of, capacities, which is a combination of lung volumes. So we have the inspiratory capacity, we have the vital capacity, we have the functional residual capacity, and the total lung capacity. In some cases, they also have the expiratory capacity. So the volume of air that is inspired or expired with each normal breath is a tidal volume. This is about 500 ml in the average adult male. The inspiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that can be inspired above the normal tidal volume with a person inspiring with full force. To do this, the thorax has to expand maximally using accessory muscles on top of the main muscles of inspiration in order to generate a big drop in pleural pressures. It is a reserve volume because the air is not used during normal breathing. Conversely, the expiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that can be maximally expired by forceful expiration after the end of a normal tidal volume. This is approximately 1,100 ml. The residual volume is the air that remains in the lungs after the most forceful expiration. This volume of air is needed to maintain the patency of the airways, and this averages 1,200 ml. Residual volume is measured indirectly. In describing events in the pulmonary cycle, it is sometimes desirable to consider 2 or more of the volumes together. Such combinations are called pulmonary capacities. Inspiratory capacity is simply the amount of air a person can breathe in after a normal expiration and distending the lungs maximally. This is the sum of the inspiratory tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. The functional residual capacity is the amount of air that remains after a normal expiration and composes of the residual volume and the expiratory reserve volume. The vital capacity, which is about 4,600 ml, is the maximum amount of air that a person can expel from the lungs after first filling the lungs to their maximum extent and then expiring to the maximum extent. It is the sum of the inspiratory and expiratory reserve volume as well as the tidal volume. The total lung capacity is the maximum volume to which the lungs can be expanded with the greatest possible effort, which is around 5,800 ml. This is the sum of the vital capacity and the residual volume. Functional residual capacity is important to lung function. Its value changes markedly in some types of pulmonary disease, thus it is often desirable to measure this capacity. However, it cannot be measured directly because the air in the residual volume of lungs cannot be expired into the spirometer. But it can be obtained using gas diffusion method. Residual volume and total lung capacity can then be calculated. The minute respiratory volume is the total amount of new air moved into the respiratory passages each minute and is equal to the product of the tidal volume and the respiratory rate. The normal tidal volume is about 500 ml and the normal respiratory rate is about 12 breaths per minute. This will give us an MRV of 6 liters per minute. The respiratory rate occasionally rises to 40 to 50 per minute, and the tidal volume can become as great as the vital capacity. From 500 to, well, it can rise to up to 4,600 ml. This can give a minute respiratory volume greater than 200 liters per minute compared to 6 liters per minute. It's more than 30 times the normal, and most people cannot sustain even a half of these values beyond 1 minute. For high respiratory rates, this can cause respiratory alkalosis, and high tidal volumes can cause barotrauma, decreased venous return, and reduced cardiac output. The ultimate importance of pulmonary ventilation is to continually renew the air in the gas exchange areas of the lungs, like the alveoli, alveolar sacs, alveolar ducts, and respiratory bronchioles. Some of the air a person breathes never reaches the gas exchange areas, but simply fills respiratory passages where gas exchange does not occur, such as the nose, the pharynx, and trachea. This air is called dead space air because it is not useful for gas exchange. And the part of the respiratory passages not involved in gas exchange are called anatomical dead spaces. On expiration, the air in the dead space is expired first, before any of the air from the alveoli reaches the atmosphere. Therefore, the dead space is very disadvantageous for removing the expiratory gases from the lungs. It takes several cycles before air is actually renewed. Alveoli may be non-functional or only partially functional because of absent or poor blood flow through the adjacent pulmonary capillaries. From a functional point of view, this alveoli must also be considered dead space. When the alveolar dead space is included in the total measurement of dead space, this is called the physiological dead space. In a normal person, the anatomical and physiological dead spaces are nearly equal because almost all of the alveoli are functional in the normal lung. However, in a person with partially functional or non-functional alveoli in some parts of the lungs, the physiological dead space may be as much as 10 times the volume of the anatomical dead space, or 1 to 2 liters. Alveolar ventilation per minute is the total volume of new air entering the alveoli and adjacent gas exchange areas each minute. The volume of new air per breath is tidal volume minus the dead space volume, which gives us 350 ml. This is multiplied by the number of breaths per minute, which is around 12. This will result to a ventilation rate of 4,200 ml per minute. This figure highlights the respiratory passageways. The air is distributed to the lungs by way of the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. One of the most important challenges in the respiratory passageways is to keep them open and allow easy passage of air to and from the alveoli. To keep the trachea from collapsing, multiple cartilage rings extend about 5/6 of the way around the trachea. In the walls of the bronchi also, there are less extensive curved cartilage plates, which maintains a reasonable amount of rigidity and yet allows sufficient motion for the lungs to expand and contract. These cartilage plates become progressively less extensive in the latter generations of bronchi and are actually gone in the bronchioles. Bronchioles are kept expanded mainly by the same transpulmonary pressures that expand the alveoli. That is, as the alveoli enlarge, the bronchioles also enlarge, but not as much really. Smooth muscles are found in areas of the trachea and bronchi which are not occupied by cartilage. The walls of the bronchioles are almost entirely made up of smooth muscles. Many obstructive diseases of the lung result from narrowing of the smaller bronchi and the larger bronchioles, often because of the presence of the smooth muscles, which will cause excessive contraction. The most terminal bronchiole, called the respiratory bronchiole, is mainly made up of pulmonary epithelium and underlying fibrous tissue, and a few smooth muscle fibers, and as mentioned is kept open by transpulmonary pressure. Under normal respiratory conditions, air flows through the respiratory passageway so easily that less than 1 centimeter water pressure gradient from the alveoli to the atmosphere is sufficient to cause enough airflow for quiet breathing. Resistance to airflow is greatest in some of the larger bronchioles and the bronchi near the trachea, and not in the minute air passages of the terminal bronchioles. There are relatively few of these larger bronchi in comparison with the approximately 65,000 parallel terminal bronchioles, through each of which only a minute amount of air must pass. Because smaller bronchioles are easily occluded by smooth muscle contraction, by wall edema, or by mucus collection in the lumens, they play a significant role in determining airway resistance in some diseases. Direct control of the bronchioles by sympathetic nerve fibers is relatively weak. However, the bronchial tree is very much exposed to norepinephrine and epinephrine released into the blood by sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal gland medulla. But both these hormones, especially epinephrine, because of its greater stimulation of beta-adrenergic receptors, cause dilatation of the bronchial tree. A few parasympathetic nerve fibers from the vagus nerves penetrate the lung parenchyma. They secrete acetylcholine and when activated cause mild to moderate constriction of the bronchioles. Superimposed parasympathetic nervous stimulation often worsens the bronchial constriction caused by asthma. Giving of atropine, which blocks the effects of acetylcholine, can sometimes relax the respiratory passages enough to relieve the obstruction. Parasympathetic nerves are also activated by reflexes that originate in the lungs. Most of these reflexes begin with irritation of the epithelial membrane of the respiratory passageways. Also, a bronchial constrictor reflex often occurs when microemboli occlude small pulmonary arteries. Several substances formed in the lungs are often quite active in causing bronchiolar constrictions. Two of the most important of these are histamine and slow reactive substance of anaphylaxis. The same irritants that cause parasympathetic constrictor reflexes of the airways, like smoke, dust, sulfur dioxide, and some of the acidic elements in smog, may also act directly on the lung tissue to initiate local non-nervous reactions that cause obstructive constriction of the airways. As air passes through the nose, three distinct normal respiratory functions are performed by the nasal cavities. First, the air is warmed by the extensive surface of the turbinates or the conchae and the septum. Second, the air is almost completely humidified even before it passes beyond the nose. And third, the air is partially filtered. These functions together are called the air conditioning function of the upper respiratory airways. The hairs at the entrance to the nostrils are important for filtering out large particles. Much more important, though, is the removal of particles by turbulent precipitation. That is, the air passing through the nasal passageway hits many obstructing veins, like the conchae or the turbinates, the septum, and the pharynx. Each time air hits one of these obstructions, it must change its direction of movement. The particles suspended in the air, having far more mass and momentum than air, cannot change the direction of travel as rapidly as the air can. Therefore, they continue forward, striking the surfaces of the obstructions, and are entrapped in the mucous coating and transported by the cilia to the pharynx to be swallowed. No particles larger than 6 micrometers in diameter enter the lungs through the nose. Of the remaining particles, many that are 1 to 5 micrometer settle in the smaller bronchioles as a result of gravitational precipitation. Some particles diffuse against the walls of the alveoli, especially those which are less than 1 micrometer in diameter, and they adhere to the alveolar fluid. Many particles smaller than 0.5 micrometer in diameter remain suspended in the alveolar air and are expelled by expiration. Particles of cigarette smoke are about 0.3 micrometer. Almost none of these particles are precipitated in the respiratory passageways before they reach the alveoli. Up to 1/3 of them precipitate in the alveoli by the diffusion process. Many of the particles that become entrapped in the alveoli are removed by alveolar macrophages. Others are carried away by the lung lymphatics. An excess of particles can cause growth of fibrous tissue in the alveolar septae, leading to permanent debility. Okay, so now we've reached the end of our lecture. I was supposed to make a summary to at least end the lecture, but since we will still be meeting later for the Q&A, then I will reserve my summary until then. So if you have any questions, please write them down so that you don't forget it. I will appreciate your questions. You may let me know in advance what your questions are. They might be too difficult for me to answer, but I'll try my best to answer them. Okay, so I hope the Q&A portion will be fruitful later. Okay, so see you then.